Hello again, and yes, it's my opportunity to share the scripture again with you. And I'm quite enjoying this series of Bible studies myself because it's just a fresh opportunity to really go into these scriptures in more depth. I'm using the authorized version, and I'm up to Acts chapter 9. Unfortunately, I have to confess that chapter 8 and chapter 9, really, it's difficult to deal with them in just 25 minutes, but I'll do what I can. So we come from chapter 8, which was very remarkable because it dealt with Philip. Now we come on, and in the first verse, we're dealing with Saul. And Saul, yes, was breathing out threatenings and slaughter against the disciples of the Lord. And he went to the high priest and desired of him letters to Damascus, to the synagogues, that if he found any of this way, and by the way, that's how they were defined at this moment in the Acts, if he found any, whether they were men or women, that he should arrest them and bring them bound, probably in chains, into Jerusalem. Now, I'm very intrigued even this far into chapter 9 because Saul is a very unusual character. The other disciples mainly had comprised fishermen and men that were said to be unlearned, but Saul was highly schooled in the Jewish tradition. And not only that, but he also, as we find out later in the Acts, had Roman citizenship. Now, this is quite remarkable. So we have a man still called Saul, although his name was to be changed later, and he's a man with a completely different situation. He's well versed in the scriptures and is determined to uphold the scripture. It doesn't say that he was a priest, or at this point it's not describing him in any religious terms, but he was obviously a religious fanatic, because we do know that it was Saul that held the clothes when they killed the first Christian martyr. So now here he is, very determined, very religious, and he's gone to the high priest to get the highest level of authority in order to arrest and imprison all those who are known as of this way. They were the Christians, they were the followers of Jesus. And so he sets out on his journey. And as he traveled, in verse 3 we find, he was approaching Damascus. And by the way, I'm very familiar with all these areas. Suddenly, on that road, there shone a light from heaven that was so brilliant that you can see what happened. He fell to the ground, heard a voice saying, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" And he said, "Who are you?" I mean, that's an obvious question because, as we know, the light was so bright and so intense that it blinded him. And he is, and I'm assuming when he's saying this, he's actually blind, and he's fallen down, and he says to this person or power or authority that can blind him, "Who are you?" But he does add, "Who are you, Lord?" And the Lord said, "I'm Jesus, whom you have persecuted." It's hard for you to kick against the pricks. It's very interesting at this stage because Jesus himself recognizes that it was extremely hard for someone who had grown up at the highest level of learning in the Jewish faith to turn against it. And so what Jesus is saying, it's hard for you to kick against the pricks. I'm absolutely convinced at this stage that Saul was under some level of conviction, but unfortunately that conviction was not leading him to Christ. That conviction was leading him deeper into persecuting the Christians. And in verse 6, he answered the Lord, and he was trembling, and he was astonished. Well, who wouldn't be at such an experience? And he said, Lord, what do you want me to do? It's very interesting. I find very interesting because it's very clear that there's a direct communication from the Lord. And he's speaking to the Lord, and the Lord is answering him. And he says, what do you want me to do? And the Lord said, get up, go into the city, and when you do, you will receive instructions. And again, sometimes the Lord is like this. Certainly in my life, I've had this level of communication from the Lord, where basically he says, go and do something, and only then will you find out what I want. It's not as if he was told exactly, and the whole sequence of events is so clearly planned. And I want you to understand that this can be our lives. Our lives, I certainly know, and it's proved without any question that my life has been just as ordered as this, and that I did receive instruction, and I was told where to go. Why do I say that? The evidence is there because of what inevitably happens. Whether it was that first trip to Jerusalem that opened my eyes to the persecution in the communist countries, or whatever it was, I was acting under instruction, and God did exactly what he promised. So he's told to go into the city without knowing. You know, he reminds me here of Abraham, because Abraham was told to leave the place he was living and to go into a far place. And he actually never reached the final destination. But he did not know. It said of Abraham, he went, but he didn't know where he was going. That's even more extreme. But here, so he's got to obey, go to the city. That's Damascus. And in verse 7, the men which traveled with him were speechless. I'm sure they were speechless. They heard the voice, but they saw no one. So verse 8, Saul got up from the ground, and when he opened his eyes, he discovered he was blind. It's obvious that he had closed his eyes, probably because of the brilliance of the light, but it's absolutely clear he saw nothing. And the people that were with him in verse 8 led him by the hand, a blind man, and brought him into Damascus.